Hello, in a previous video I discussed phrasals and the myth of phrasals. And so this video here expands on that, and I'd like to talk about the particle involved in a phrasal, whether it be a phrasal verb, phrasal noun, or phrasal adjective. These words are generally used to replace bigger words, usually French origin or more abstract or formal words. Or then, in order to give the word more nuance, you might pack two actions into one. For a verb to be considered a phrasal, however, the particle need be an adverb. The exponent need make the verb, for example, take on, to take on a new meaning. Generally speaking, it should carry a more figurative or intellectual meaning than a physical one. When the particle after a verb is a preposition, since it doesn't belong to the same syntax node in a syntax tree as the verb, and forms part of a prepositional phrase, one can only technically call the verb with the prepositional phrase a phrasal, but not necessarily a phrasal verb. If the sense is idiomatic rather than literal, as opposed to figurative, the sense of the preposition only hints at the prepositional phrase, as is the case when ellipsis is involved. Consider, to change buses, you can get off at the next stop. Now, to change buses, you can get off the first bus at the next stop. Disembark the bus, the first bus, and take another bus. Note that although get on signifies embark or board, it's a physical action, not a figurative one. Off the bus is the prepositional phrase here and is not directly related to the process of getting a bus, but the state of being off the bus. So for more details on that, we'll have another video on the word get and the myriad uses of get. But more importantly, and we'll get to that in this video, is the aspect of a verb being transitive or intransitive. Of course, sometimes both or either, but those have a more significant role of, adverb versus preposition. Contrary to German, where the particle is a prefix, like aufstehen, verstehen, in English, the particle follows the stem. It is modifying to form a single semantic unit, giving us an altogether unique word. I tend to disagree that it's a unique word because the verb itself can have many meanings. So, for example, the verb come, can mean in the direction of the speaker, come, but it also has many different meanings, even without the particle. So in English, the verb is detached from the particle, while the noun and particle is generally written together or hyphenated. And this is, of course, purely a visual aspect when you're reading. However, the particle adds meaning, obviously so, since each explicit word bears meaning. Up, for instance, hints at completion or termination or tempo. Finish up means hurry and finish or completely finish. Hurry up instead of hurry, which in German is sich beeilen, beeilen. Eilen is the verb and beeilen, be would be the prefix. The lack of an explicit reflexive pronoun in English is the subject for another video. However, prepositions too can serve as a movement, and so the verb then becomes adverbial in a sense. Consider into. It can be in the direction of and often towards the speaker, but it's also used to mean transform in either an intellectual or physical way. Phrasals are so commonplace in English that it wouldn't be fair to say they're strictly informal, although academics will prefer and expect a more formal equivalent. And that doesn't make the formal word the better choice. Or, for example, I've heard it said that, in business English, we should avoid teaching or using phrasals, which is really an impossibility because we just use them all the time. They're idiomatic, and idioms are used everywhere in business, the language of business jargon. So looking at the chart that I have in my ebook, stems from John Flower's book, Phrasal Verb Organiser, where he sort of lists the intrinsic meaning behind these particles. So you can see certain ones here, like up and down, out and in, off and on. And I've even added a few meanings there in blue to where I think are important. So you might have even the word back as returning, a reference to past time or bringing back memories, but also a reversal. Away is, of course, continuous activity. You could say he's typing away, but it also can mean a distance. Or if I talk about through, we could say it's something we see to completion. And if you see something through, or if you do something thoroughly, you see it through. Again, as with away, through being adverbs, they are also more rarely seen as a preposition. If I say they saw through hard times, it means they endured something until a desired result, hopefully. The question is, does through belong to the verb? In which case, how hard times were seen, or does through belong to the concept of hardship? Then there's another aspect of phrasal verbs being separable or inseparable. But does it really matter? The concept of whether a verb can be transitive, marked in a dictionary with a VTR or TR, those will take a complement. Or the intransitive without an object, that's important. However, whether a phrasal is inseparable or whether the particle need be adjacent to the verb or separable, where the object can come in between, as in turn the TV off or turn off the TV, is irrelevant. Grammarians will make a rule of this and say when the object is replaced by an object pronoun, put the pronoun in between, must go in between. And so we say turn it off and not turn off it. However, that should be self-evident since turn it off, it being the electronical device before the adverb off was not fronted, given that the adverb's natural position is anyway after a direct object, when there is one. Turn off, after all, is not a preposition. Either turn off the TV or turn the TV off is nevertheless both acceptable. And so the idea of having so-called separable phrasals is flawed. We won't say turn off it simply because off does not get fronted. Unlike English adjectives, which generally do get fronted before the noun in a noun phrase, we do have intrinsic grammar. And native speakers determine how malleable that can be, while grammarians prefer to determine a language's limitations, imposing rules. Another perspective is that you can actually front adverbs. And so sometimes an adverb may be fronted. Consider, he comes across often as being naive, where often is arguably a simplified version of the word oftentimes. So, for example, he comes across as being naive oftentimes, but of course, it's idiosyncratic syntax to break the rules and say he often comes across as being naive, because there were no rules to break to begin with. If native speakers break the rules, it's because those in place wouldn't allow for fluency. Unlearn any rules you might be taught and understand the English mind. So back to what I was saying about transitive versus intransitive. Verbs used in a figurative sense, together with the adverb away, for example, can be classified into two categories. You have transitive, needing an object, and intransitive, not able to take an object. And so in my book, I will list certain verbs that have the particle away and show which ones are transitive, which need an object, and those which don't. And I think this is a useful way of looking at these types of verbs. And then on the right, I give the figurative meaning with notes. In another document, I question phrasals. If we're looking at the set of multi-verbs like start out, start off, set out, set off, at least one of the definitions, even though they're separate entries in a dictionary, really all relate to the same thing. You'll have the same definition for start out and start off, as well as set out and set off, as you can see here. So you'll find separate entries, though if a thesaurus doesn't dedicate a section for synonyms for these, it may be because they don't acknowledge them as being phrasal verbs as a separate entry. Even then, however, they are phrases that appear under words section, even if there is a section phrases, let's say in the Collins dictionary application. Studying the four images, we see where set out is like embarking, same with start. We have to consider the contextual factor. The connotations are distinct. So here I break it down. We have the verb start, which means initiate or begin, but also cause to begin or set in motion. And set as a verb means resolutely arrange, establish, among other things. The particle off triggers the action or chain of events, whereas out means outward, in the open, or fully, but may also hint at a change of events. So if I say, for example, she started out as a salesperson, we hint at the fact there's been a change of event. And she may have started out as a salesperson and she went on to be a director. If I say they started out wanting a house, but eventually bought a flat, of course, this makes it even more explicit, the change of event. In either case, the adverb out is not necessary, and is, if not an embellishment, it implies out changing the sense of the verb. This may be the rationale behind falsely associating the name phrasal with the adverb particle. An adverb only adds information to the verb and therefore does not make the verb a phrasal. In any case, I expect that the rise of the so-called phrasal verb is the culprit of having separate entries for these in dictionaries and countless other ones. Note that the Collins won't actually go so far as to indicate phrasal verb, though, likely because that terminology is contested by linguists today. The myth, however, remains in teaching English. Plus, although the application is a thesaurus, why those entries lack the formal equivalent is not known to me. In any case, labeling them phrasals would not actually help learners understand the inner workings of each of the words themselves and how each particle adds meaning to the word, whether it be a verb, noun, or adjective, nor how they connect to which part of the clause or stem. As I explain in several files in my book, if the particle is a preposition, it always connects to what follows. Then there is the aspect of whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. the phrasal is separable, it's most likely not a phrasal, as some other professionals have pointed out. You can tell, by the way, if the particle is an adverb by asking how the action is effected. Consider the phrase to set out one's stall. Chiefly in the UK, it means to make the necessary arrangements for achieving something and to demonstrate one's determination to achieve it. So you've got kind of two concepts in one. This is often the case with phrasals. So just to end here, phrasals is just another aspect of how English is idiosyncratic. Thanks for watching.